Well, thank you for inviting me to this virtual event. So this is very much a tag team talk. I guess I'm the warm-up act for Coralie, because Coralie is going to be talking about the archaeology, and I'm going to be really focusing on the fundamentals of trees and tree ring science for both studying climate and I guess environmental change and environmental impacts on tree growth. And then Coralie will then talk about the archaeology aspects. So very much a tag team, and I'll try and keep within the 30 minutes. So COP26 is coming up, so I have to briefly talk about the importance of why we need to understand climate change. So very briefly, I will just sort of put the context of Scottish climate change in with the global picture. And then I'm going to talk about the background of dendrochronology, so tree ring science, as both Coralie and I sort of apply it. And then I will briefly talk about dendroclimatology, so that's using trees to study past climate within the Scottish environment. Wrapped into all of that will be what we've called the Scottish Pine Project, which has been ongoing for the last 15 years, the living pine woodlands that we've sampled, and also how we've extended the living data set back in time. Very brief presentations of some of the information with regards to the reconstructions of past climate, and then I'll just dip into the 17th century because it stands out as such a miserable period in Scottish history and Scottish climate history that it's always worth noting, just to sort of put that in context with where we're at today. And then I'm going to finish off with really what I hope to be talking about in a year's time or 2 years' time about our ongoing work with regards to the pine dendrochronology in Scotland. This ties in really with our current climate change and our adaptation to climate change, or what we do with regards to managing woodland and so forth, because our shifts are really changing away from understanding climate and climate change now to really how we live with it. So I will move on. So well, climate is changing. I hope everyone in this virtual room agrees with me. I'm quite happy to have a debate later if need be. But the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has this statement where they basically state that a global warming of 1.5 degrees relative to pre-industrial levels, so that's say before 1880, will likely lead to irreversible effects on the climate system and substantial impacts on human society. Just to put that in context, if we just look at a spatial pattern of climate change relative to the pre-industrial, so this is the last 20 years of annual temperatures globally and how much warmer they are compared to 1880 to 1990, you will see that much of the change we see in the global sense is in the northern high latitudes of the northern hemisphere, okay, where the dark reds we see in northern North America and much of northern Eurasia are changes in excess of 2 to 3 to 4 degrees temperature Celsius temperature degrees. In Scotland, we are lucky with regards to our climate change is relatively buffered by our proximity to the North Atlantic, and we have seen maybe a modest 1 to 1.5 degree change depending on which season you look at in the data. So there's a very much a spatial pattern across the whole globe is pretty much warming, but some areas are warming at a slower rate. So if we look at the sort of the time series of annual temperatures for Scotland since the late 19th century, then we've had a modest warming of 1.3 degrees since around the 1870s and 1890 period right up to present. Now, that 1 degree might not sound much, but that 1 degree is impacting our environment, whether it be our forests, agricultural systems and so forth. And we need to understand, as the climate most likely will continue warming in the future, how we manage that change in our local and regional climate. Regardless of what the global situation is doing, it's kind of important to understand about what the changes are going to do in Scotland and how then we might mitigate or at least adapt and manage our environment around us. So to fully appreciate and understand current climate change, we need to place the recent changes into some sort of longer term context, and trees provide a beautiful archive, at least for the very recent centuries, for placing change of the last few decades, or last 100 years or so, back 300, 400, 500 years, depending on how far we can extend the data sets back in time. So this is where the science of dendrochronology comes in. Basically, this is the science of dating tree ring archives. Okay, so we know the exact calendar year on which a ring was formed, and then interpreting the information that is within those different archives, whether they be pine trees, oak trees, elm, alder, wherever. Okay, so that is the science of dendrochronology, and there are many subfields within the larger scope or the umbrella term of dendrochronology. Now, we can measure lots and lots of data from tree ring archives, and I'm not going to go into lots of detail, but we can measure the width of the rings. We can actually measure parameters within those ring widths of the trees, the early wood width, the late wood width. We can measure density. So these are all parameters that I would commonly measure from conifer species like pine and spruce. But if we're looking at deciduous trees, we could again measure the ring width value, or the early wood width, or the late wood width, or even the early wood vessel areas if you're looking at ring poor species and so forth. And then the new kids on the block, just move that there because it's the new kids on the block with regards to the data types here. And this is, I'm mentioning this now because Coralie might mention this with regards to the historical work that we've been doing in Scotland, is that we have been developing over the last decade or so much cheaper ways of measuring relative ring density from trees that has allowed a real revolution with the historical dating of timbers from buildings. Okay, and then, you know, basically for almost the same cost as measuring ring width, we can measure these other density parameters, and they really give us a very strong common signal across space, which allows us to pattern match tree ring series together. And then for anyone who knows anything about chemistry, we can also measure stable isotopes, a much more expensive approach for measuring parameters from tree rings, but the oxygen isotopes certainly in oak trees within the United Kingdom provide a beautiful metric for dating purposes as well, for historical dating. And I'll leave all the dating stuff to Coralie later on in the talk. But I'm talking about patterns basically, and essentially when we take samples from a living tree, we know the outer ring just inside of the bark. So that might be for 2021 at the moment. It's now October, so that the growth has stopped for this year. And we can then look at the rings going back in the lives of these trees, and we might sample many trees from a particular site. And, on average in Scotland, at least for pine trees, most of the pine trees are probably 2 to 250 years in age. There are certainly older specimens as well. But then we can go into buildings, as long as they've been constructed with material of the same species from roughly the same region, and then if that building was built in, say, 1820, we can then overlap and pattern match the sequences from that building material, and then build back a chronology and get an exact date of that phase or construction of that building and so forth. And so wherever we've got preserved material, whether that's in a building or other archaeological sources, or we're getting into natural environments like peat bogs or lake sediments, and then they've got material of that species, we can then look at the patterns in the ring widths and the other parameters we can measure from the tree ring archives, and we can build back chronologies going back many centuries, and certainly for Scotland now, for pine, we go back over 1,000 years. But the longest chronologies in Europe are the oak chronologies for Central Europe, and they go back 10,000 years using this process, and this is called cross dating. So again, I'll leave that all to Coralie, but that's where the historical aspect and the crucial application of dendrochronology is for archaeology. So I'm a paleoclimatologist, so I use trees to study past climate. But the reality is trees are responders to many different factors within the environment. So how do we tease out those signals or that information that we want? Now, don't panic about the equation. It's more of a conceptual equation, but we can imagine that the growth of a tree each year is an amalgamation of different environmental forcings. So as a climatologist, I'm interested in climate. So there'll be some aspect of climate that will have an impact on the growth of trees. It could be temperature, precipitation, could be sunlight, okay, whatever parameter that we're interested in. And then we might have at the tree level a sort of tree specific signal. It could be related to lightning strike or canopy opening because neighboring trees have died. So there's an opening and a release in growth. Or we might then have a stand-wide signal where there could be impacts of fire, insect attack, disease, pollution, woodland management, silviculture and so forth. And so putting all of these different environmental variables together, okay, is the real challenge for the dendrochronologist, because different dendrochronologists might want to study different aspects that are actually driving the growth of those trees. So I'm interested in climate, but an ecologist might be actually much more interested in the disturbance history of some insect outbreak or whatever. So that's the background of dendrochronology in a very brief thing. I have a 3-hour lecture if you want to listen to it. You have to log in though for that one. But about 15 years ago, I started what is now called the Scottish Pine Project. It's collaborative. It has a focus on climate, ecology and archaeology within the Scottish environment. Coralie's been involved since the beginning, and many colleagues from around the UK and across Scandinavia. This is a link to the website. And initially, I went out to basically sample or take representative samples from every pine woodland in Scotland. And also we wanted to extend the information beyond the living data set by also taking samples from historical structures and also going into the high elevation locks in the highlands where dead trees had fallen in and the wood was preserved in the lake sediments. And then we could use that material for building these chronologies back in time. And my initial overall aim was to derive a long temperature reconstruction for the Scottish region or northern Britain. Then we could use that to come up with inferences of past climate and to look for periods where climate was, say, much colder or much warmer than today, or at least put the present day changes into that longer term context. So going back to the sort of methodological aspect, what I wanted to do as a climatologist is we want to maximize the climate signal and try to minimize all the other signals. So the first thing is our sampling is very targeted. It must be very strategic. We want to go into environments where the growth of the trees is predominantly controlled by one climate parameter. So we're not interested in those trees that are growing out on our lawns or in parks where there's plenty of soil, lots of nutrients, plenty of sunlight and so forth. We're interested in those trees that are literally hanging off the edge of the mountain or on a big talus slope somewhere where soils are thin, the temperature tree line or the tree line at that point might be temperature controlled and so forth. So we're looking for the stressed trees where the growth from one year to the next is strongly controlled or coupled with climate. So as rough rules of thumb, as a sort of general concept, and this is relevant for pretty much any tree species across the whole planet, if we're interested in studying past temperature change, we want to go to a species high elevation or high latitude limit, right? The tree line limit, right? And there is a tree line because further north or higher elevations from that tree line, it's basically too cold in the summer for cell formation, and so the trees don't grow. At the same time, if you're interested in precipitation or hydroclimate, then you need to go to low elevations or low latitudes where conditions are much drier, and then the variability in the tree growth is controlled by moisture availability. We can enhance that climate signal as well if we go to ecologically extreme sites. So, for example, in the Highlands, we could go to a talus slope system like Glenfeshie or the Green Loch in Rheinvoren Pass at Glenmore, where the trees are growing really on very thin soils there. They're also at high elevations, so their sensitivity to temperature variability is particularly strong. And after 15 years of work now, we can pretty much extract a pretty robust temperature signal from any pine tree growing between about 250 meters elevation up to about 600 meters elevation. But the higher you go, the stronger that climate signal is. The last thing is, how do we minimize that kind of tree-specific noise or the standwise noise or disturbance? So at the tree level, we basically just go into a site and we sample many, many trees. This is just some example plots of, we've sampled about 10 trees here. The lower plot here, all the red lines are just those from above. And you can see that every tree has its own little story which deviates away from the average. But the blue line is the average here, and that is the one that maximizes the common signal, which hopefully is a reasonably strong climate signal. And in Scotland with Scots pine, we probably, on average sample at least 30 to 40 trees per woodland that we target. And many of these areas, we might be sampling multiple sites within these regions as well. When it comes to trying to minimize site-specific but stand-wise disturbance effects, then the only way to address that is to then sample a network. So we have sampled over 50 sites around pine sites around Scotland now. This is just some time series plots of some sites from the Cairngorms going from Abernethy in the north all the way down through Glenmore into Rothiemurcus, Glenfeshie, and ending up in Mar Lodge, and then finishing off with the Balmoral, Ballackbury woodlands down at the bottom. And you see where it's the time series is red. That's basically just saying where growth is above average, so conditions for growth are relatively good, and where the time series is blue, then the conditions of growth at that time is relatively low, leading to relatively slow growth rates. And because of where we're sampling, where these are temperature limited, then we can infer these without any statistics as periods of warmer when they're red and periods of colder when it's blue. Okay, so you can see amongst all of these sites periods of common colder and warmer periods, but intermixed in all of that is difference, right? Every site is slightly different. So you could look at this site here from Rothiemurcus, where it's kind of decreasing in the recent period here in the 20th century. It doesn't show the warming trend that many of the other sites do. And that is entirely a sort of response to timber clearance, not only in the 19th century, but also probably around the Second World War. And that site, or those trees in that region, are still recovering from that timber extraction at that time, and the site is still sort of resetting itself towards some sort of natural state. But through these networks, we can identify and extract the common signal between all of them, which is that climate signal that I'm interested in. So as of about 4 years ago, and the reason I used 2017 was because that was the end of what I would call phase one. It was a decade's worth of work where we published a whole bunch of climate papers and archaeological based papers. At that time, we had sampled a network of about 50 sites, roughly representing the full extent of the semi-natural pine woodland network. 2 of those sites had trees that germinated, started growing in the 15th century, around the 1450s, and even a couple of sites around the 16th century as well. So we found some really old individuals in the Scottish Highlands, which, you know, it's really surprising when the average age is about 200 to 250 years old. Most of the woodlands are in a state of recovery since substantial human interference and timber extraction in the 18th and the 19th century. And then for the subfossil material, so this is material we're dragging out of lakes to extend the living network, our predominant focus was on the northwest Cairngorm, so Rothiemurcus through to Abernethy, but we've also sampled a profound amount of material also from Glen Affric, because there's multiple lochans in the Glen Affric area as well. Just to give you a flavour of the potential excitement that we had sort of 10 years ago when we started with this work, this is just an image of some of the subfossil material that's in, this is Loch Gowan in, or Gamna, depending on how you want to pronounce it, in Rothiemurcus. And you can see these features of old logs. Some of them are recent, some of them more ancient. And in the very early days, we took literally with pruning saws, we took some random samples from Loch Gowan and Loch Ellen in the Rothiemurcus regions. I think we did 25 samples. We sent them off for carbon dating. I was expecting maybe some dates in the last 1,000 years or so. But when the results came back, we had material that was covering the full 8,000 years of much of the Holocene period. So this is just a histogram of the counts of dates over the last 8,000 years. So left is towards present, right is 8,000 years ago. And you can see for the last 2,000 years, we've got a lot of material. Then there's a bit of a gap between 2,000 and 5,000 years ago. And then we get to the early to mid Holocene when we get a lot of more material again going back at that time. So the focus of this talk and the much of the work I've done in the last 10 years or 15 years is actually only the last 1,000 to 2,000 years. We've got a whole rich archive going back for the 8,000 years that is just ready for us to start analysing and looking at those data. And I'll very briefly talk about that as we go through this talk. So the status we have now is we have a continuous chronology when we just put all the Northwest Cairngorms and Glen Affric material together. We have a continuous archive of living and subfossil material going back to the 12th century. When I did this figure a few years ago, we had a gap in the 12th century. This is actually now filled with a few trees, which is great, which means that we can start actually really tying in these carbon dated material from all the way back from the sort of 3rd century to the 5th century, and then about the 6th century to the 10th century period. So although I'm only going to really present quick results for the last 800 years or so, the potential for extending back almost 2,000 years for Scotland now is really, we're almost there. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, right? We've got to fill in those gaps, and it's just a matter of luck whether we can find the samples. So the published reconstructions from the Tree Ring archives to date have come from mainly the northwest Cairngorm, so again, Rothiemurchus through to Abernethy, but we have used the wider Scottish network to come up with spatial reconstructions. I'm not going to talk about the spatial reconstructions, but we have got separate reconstructions from half a degree grids, basically representing the gridded climate data that we have for Scotland. And where you have a grid that's in red or darker red, then the data quality is very good, i.e. we have a very good picture of past climate going back a few centuries. But where we get the yellows and the greys and the blues, then the quality of the reconstruction start breaking down. And there were odd things happening in the West that we are only just starting to maybe understand. And I'll briefly finish with that because that's really the focus of a lot of our work at the moment. But I'm only for now going to talk about the main long reconstruction, what I call the extended reconstruction that's focused on the Northwest Cairngorms. So we published this, PhD student of mine, Milos Ridval, in 2017. This reconstruction is using material from Rothiemurchus all the way through to Abernethy, as I said. We've got about 350 living trees from multiple locations throughout this region. And then from multiple loch-ins, we've also got about 110 subfossil timbers that we've used to extend the chronology back in time. This plot just shows you the black line is the tree ring data and the red line is the instrumental summer temperatures, so July, August temperatures. And even if you don't know anything about statistics, hopefully you can visualize that the match between the tree ring data and the instrumental data is really very good, right? We're explaining almost 60% of the summer temperature variance. And then when we map that correlation spatially over the European sector, then you actually can see that this Scottish reconstruction, which is really based on material only from the Highlands, really represents the climatology for summer temperatures for most of the UK and even into northwest France. So it is really, really exciting data set. And there's similar data sets from Scandinavia and the Alps and so forth. So we've got this bigger picture of climate that's building up as a mosaic for the whole of the Northern Hemisphere, which is another lecture. So this is what the reconstruction looks at, or the published one to date. We can clearly see periods, warm periods, but prolonged periods of cooler conditions. So this is all relative to the climate norm or the mean climatology from 1961 to 1990. You can see the recent warming in the recent period. But then if you look back in time, you can see that the warmest century is basically the 20th century into the 21st century, where the coldest century is basically the 17th century. And you can see that that was a prolonged period where temperatures were on average about 1 to 1.5 degrees colder than they are today. Okay. Now I could spend hours talking about this record, but I'm just going to jump in onto one particular period just for the kicks because it stands out. Ali Dawson from the University of Aberdeen a few years ago, about a decade ago now, produced this really nice book about historical observations of weather and climate from Scotland. So Foul and Fair a Day, A History of Scotland's Weather and Climate. And if you actually look through that book and then tie that in with the extreme warm and definitely colder anomalies in our reconstruction, the coincidence or the match is wonderful. So we look at our reconstruction, all right? We've got the coldest reconstructed decade, 1695 to 1704. 1698 is the second coldest reconstructed year on record, with 1782 being the first coldest reconstruction. Now, as a climatologist, we have strong forcing for colder conditions during this period. We've got Hekla erupting, we've got a tropical volcanic event around the sort of mid 1690s, 1693, 1695. This is also the late Maunder minimum, which is a known period where the sun was less active on average compared to much of the last 1,000 years. And 1694, and many in this virtual room I'm sure are aware, 1694 is the first year of famine and 7 years of famine, and this is known as the Scottish Ills. And in Ali's book is this great quote for this period: "From the unfortunate year 1694 till 1701, the land seemed as if struck with barrenness, and such was the change in the climate that the seasons of summer and winter were cold and gloomy in nearly the same degree." And you can really see this decadal cold pulse sticking out in the whole of the record. And there's no surprise, right? We have 7 years of famine, meaning the crops failed. Well, trees are essentially a crop, right? And unlike a cereal, they're a bit more resilient and can survive these periods, but their productivity decreases. So the Tree Ring Archive really picks this up very, very well. So it's a beautiful record, and we're trying to enhance it, and I'll briefly talk about that. So just to finish off, I want to talk about where we're going now, right? So this picture here, this sort of slight, I've purposely graded out. This is one of the oldest trees in Scotland. This is in Mar Lodge. Its germination date was in 1450, and it's actually a very healthy old beast. Beautiful tree. So updating. So we are now actively trying to continue updating the pine network here. So all the green circles represent sites we've already sampled, and all the red circles represent sites or pine woodlands that we haven't sampled. So we've done a pretty good spread. We've spent a lot of time trying to infill the west because that's where some of our data quality has been weak. But we're also now starting to sample lower elevation plantations, because it is these lower elevational sites, i.e. warmer sites because they're low elevations, that provide us with important analogues for a warmer future, i.e. what will these high elevation sites be doing in 50 years time when it might be warmer by another degree. Okay, so we're really trying to expand this network but go down elevation to give us these warmer analogues. So this is the published reconstruction as I showed you before. If we lump in all the data from some of the historical buildings we've sampled with Coralie, and also sites from Glen Affrey and so forth, this is just a preliminary draft here, but you can see that adding in much more data in this earlier period when it wasn't that well replicated in the original publication has basically suppressed our estimates for conditions back in this sort of historical period of the late medieval to cooler conditions, again highlighting the relative extremity of current warming in the context of the last 800 years. So this work will probably be published in the next year or two. We're still working on it as we put more data in. We've literally 2 weeks ago have a new PhD student starting now. This is a mixture of tree ring work plus palynology, so using pollen archives, and we're doing a transect east-west from the Cairngorms through across Rannoch and out to the west, looking and trying to understand better understand the decline and the shrinkage of the pine woodlands in the early mid-Holocene. Something that I've kind of kept myself away, even though there is loads of pine material everywhere, right? So we know that there is a decline at this period. The pollen record shows this quite clearly. The timing, however, of decline varies, because sometimes it's 4,500 years ago, sometimes it's 6,500 years ago. So we're now going back and we're doing detailed dendrochronological analysis on peat material, so not lake material, but we're also in these peat records, also taking a peat core and then trying to then bring that sediment core in line with the dendro archive. And then hopefully we get, when we're looking at sort of fecal matter to try and understand the differences between domestic herbivore stock versus more natural herbivore stock, to see if we get evidence of whether man was in the vicinity at the time when the declines happened. Because was climate the main driver, or was it man? And we don't really know, and everyone will debate, but it's really, there's a lot of work doing that. So it's literally just starting with this study, but very exciting, and I'm sure from an archaeological point of view that would be very interesting as this work develops over the coming years. As I said, we've substantially expanding the network now, and if we just look at the Cairngorms relative to the Western network, and we now compile all of this wood together, then the quality of our reconstructions is getting even better because we're just adding more and more data in. So we're explaining much more of the variability of the instrumental data, and you can see that now the Western pines are kind of pretty much showing the same story as the Cairngorm sites, which is great. Everything's looking really nice. That's exactly what I want as a climatologist. But the one thing we've noticed as we've done more and more sampling in the recent years is that in the last decade or so, something odd is happening, and it's happening in the West. And it's literally only since about 2010, but the trees of the Western sites seem to be going into some sort of relative productivity decline, whether we look at ring width or we look at the density. It's not so bad in the Cairngorms, and there are some sites that don't show the decline, but almost all sites in the West are showing decline. And it was always the West where we had problems. It was always the Western sites that were more sensitive to timber extraction, and we saw release events and so forth. So there is a fundamental potential problem happening now as we look. And so this is one of our primary aims, is to try to study what is driving this. And maybe we don't have enough data yet because we've only got a few years of decline. They might recover, but it's early days. So final thoughts, just to bring this up we have a very good understanding of past temperatures, not just for Scotland, but for the much of the globe. We know much less about hydroclimate. Certainly in northern Britain and Scotland, the tree rings, it's always wet in Scotland, right? So they're not limited. So we are shifting to different methodologies to try and give us information on past precipitation. We do know from many studies, not even just looking at the 1690s in Scotland, but from many studies around the world, that climate does impact society. So we need to be prepared for that. We need to manage that. We are entering a warmer state in Scotland. It's going to have implications. Okay, it's not only just going to get warmer, it's going to get wetter, and it's going to get windier, and especially in the west, where maybe the pine trees are starting to struggle. So our big question is then, how are these pine woodlands going to respond in the future? And so rather than looking back now for our reconstructions, we're actually going the other way, and we're now trying to model and forward model and better predict, hopefully better predict, what these pine woodlands are going to be potentially doing in the coming years and decades. And this has implications with how we manage those woodlands. So on that, I thank you for your attention. I will click stop if I can find the stop button. I've messed it up. Let me just, I should know how to do this by now, shouldn't I? Just a minute. I've moved it over here, moved it onto the other screen.
Well, thanks for that introduction, and thanks so much to Rob for, well, setting the scene. I think that's rather more than setting the scene. That's so important to understand how tree ring science contributes to our knowledge of climate change. Obviously very crucial. So I'm tonight going to really talk about the cultural heritage angle of dendrochronology in northern Scotland. And by and large, I'm going to be covering the built heritage, but if there's time at the end, I will tell you a little bit about applications in cultural wooded landscapes as well. My consultancy isn't just me. I do have colleagues, and this is just briefly to introduce you to Peter Quelch, who is a forester who was the native woodland advisor for the Forestry Commission in Scotland before he retired. He's kind of semi-retired now, but helps me with a lot of the woodland heritage projects. And I have a young colleague, Hamish Darragh, who's an archaeologist who undertook his degree at UHI, and he is just towards the end of a master's in experimental archaeology at UCD, and is a traditional woodworker, a green woodworker, as well as an archaeologist. So he is bringing additional insights to our work because he really understands woodworking technology. And hand in hand with dendrochronology, that could be very powerful for looking at our history of woodworking in Scotland. Well, in terms of dendro dating potential, just to recap some of the things that Rob mentioned in passing, many of the same principles apply to dating as they do to climate science. It is much better to have lots of rings in a sample because it's much more likely going to give you a unique pattern that will date. Short ring sequences are very, very difficult for us to work with, but there are some new techniques coming our way which will help us with dating shorter sequences, and I won't go into that here, but just be aware that that may become possible. I just wanted to show you these two ash trees, the top two photographs. These two ash trees are in the Trossachs actually, and we have aged both of them. And one of them has a girth of 4 meters and one of them has a girth of 1.5 meters, and they are exactly the same age as each other, and they're only a few hundred meters apart in slightly different growing conditions, but perhaps, well, probably because they have had different management histories. The one on the left has been pollarded, which means it has been cut high in the past to produce poles and other products. So anyway, the point is that you cannot really guess very easily the age of a tree just by looking at how big it is. And that sort of crosses over to looking at historic timbers, because people often say to me, how big does the timber need to be dendrodated? But it isn't actually the size of the timber, it is the number of rings that matters. And in Scotland, we have had a lot of very slow grown timber used in our buildings. So even a small timber can have a lot of rings in it and can have enough rings for dating. As Rob mentioned when he was talking about the common signal from a site and needing to sample 10, 20, 30 trees, you know, this is the same reason why in archaeology we need to work with groups of related timbers and not just one or two, especially with pine actually, but with any species really. And so that is why we will ask to take samples from multiple timbers. It is to improve the chances of producing a date effectively. And then the final thing to mention here is about precision. Well, dendrochronology is the most precise dating tool available to archaeologists where suitable timbers survive, because it can give you a felling date to a year. Those bottom images are of oak, and the best possible circumstance is where oak has all of its sapwood still attached, and that happens very commonly in historic timber actually. So the top of the two black and white photographs, the sapwood is the lighter stuff on the left hand side. It's a bit softer than the heartwood, but it often is still present on the timbers. And so where it's intact, we can give a felling date to a year if we can date the timber. If we have only some of it, we can give a felling date range, because we can work out how many sapwood rings within a certain range an oak tree would have. And if we don't have any sapwood and we don't know how near the heartwood sapwood boundary we are, then we usually give a terminus post quem, and you will see this TPQ abbreviation popping up in dendro reports, and that simply means a date after which for felling. So we would add on the minimum number of sapwood rings a tree would have, an oak tree would have, and give that as the terminus post quem for felling. Now, the other absolutely brilliant thing about dendrochronology is it can tell you where the timber grew. It can tell you where the trees grew, not just what date they are. And so, for example, here we are looking at the comparison of timber from Stirling Palace with the regions it matches best with, and it matches best with Denmark and southern Sweden. So the bigger the green circle, the closer the match. You'll also see that the numbers are higher, and those numbers are called t-values, and that is a statistical measure of correlation that we use in dating, in dendro dating. And so the higher the number, the closer the match. So this is basically telling us that 16th century timber in Stirling Palace came from either Denmark or the southern tip of Sweden. And as we shall see shortly, Scandinavia was frequently a source of timber for much of Scotland, because we have had timber shortages in at least parts of Scotland for a very long time. And now this map is showing you the distribution of dendro-dated sites over the last 1,000 years in Scotland. And when I say sites, I am talking about buildings and archaeology. So there are squares and triangles here. The squares are oak and the triangles are pine. The red ones are imports and the blue ones are native oak or native pine. So you can see that we've got really, most of our oak data is coming from well, the East Coast and the Central Belt, and in particular there's a big cluster around the Forth. Most of our pine dates are native, and they mostly come from the Cairngorms and a little bit around sort of Inverness, and that's the result of the Scottish Pine Project work. And I've mentioned Scott 2K here, which was one of the projects within the Scottish Pine Project that Rob and I worked on together. So I would like you to note that there are a lot of gaps, basically, in the distribution of the tree ring dates for both oak and pine in Scotland, and that we have an awful lot of gap in the north and west, really. I've been working on dendro in Scotland for a rather long time, over 30 years, alongside Anne Crone, who some of you will of course know, who is the other archaeodendrochronologist in Scotland. And we've been working together really, one way or another, over this period to try and build up the tree ring record for Scotland. So this bar diagram is really a summary of more or less where we've got to. It's a few years out of date, actually. We could add a few more details now, but with a combination of dating and provenancing, over time we can build up a picture of the character of our timber supply and where it has come from. And so at the very bottom of this diagram, or I should explain that each bar is a site, and it represents bringing together all of the separate individual timbers data for that site where they match each other, okay? And the length of the bar shows how long the tree ring sequences were, and where the bar ends on the right hand side, that is the end of the sequence. So in many cases that is the felling date, and time is going along the bottom there. So we've got 900 AD on the left, and we're coming up to 2000 AD on the right. So if you look at the bottom of the diagram, you can see that actually all those white bars, they're really long, and what they are is representing native oak sites. So we had lots of long-lived native oak turning up in medieval buildings up until around the middle of the 15th century. And then suddenly all the bars, or nearly all of them, turn grey, and those grey bars are imported oak. And so from about the middle of the 15th century to roughly around 1600, we are principally looking at imported oak. Most of the structural oak comes from Scandinavia. And we also have another type of oak. We have these really fine boards that come from further east in the Baltic. And then even later on, we are starting to see more pine. So after the middle of the, after about 1600, we see a switch from oak to pine, largely, and much of that still comes from Scandinavia. But in the middle of the 18th century, we see another switch to the Eastern Baltic for most of our imported timber. But remember the geographic distribution of these sites. There aren't very many of them in the north of Scotland. This is more of a southern and eastern view, really, and as we shall see, the picture likely to emerge from the Highlands will be very different. So I'm just going to sort of run through a sort of from the earliest to the latest over the last last 1,000 years with a few examples. Our earliest sites actually in this period really come from the early boroughs and from waterlogged timbers in the early boroughs. And there is data which has been worked up by Anne Crone from a number of our boroughs, including Inverness actually. And together they have given us really valuable tree ring data for oak that cover roughly the 10th to the 12th to 13th century. So we've got felling dates in the early boroughs in the later 12th and the early 13th century. And up in the northeast, a little later on, we have things like this. This is a well lining in Elgin. And actually, you know, I mentioned these really long ring sequences. Well, here we have really old growth oak being used to do something as mundane as lining a well. So it seems, you know, one would think at first, well, this means that timber is really plentiful. But actually, this is a very different type of material than was being used in England at this time, where there were managed oak forests with much younger timber going into oak buildings. And all this old growth stuff is not necessarily a good news story in Scotland. It probably is not managed timber on the whole, though there are exceptions. This is more like using material maybe from hunting forests, from semi-natural woodland, from natural woodland. It is not really, on the whole, managed material, probably. but there are exceptions, and Darnaway in Murray is one of the big exceptions. Now, I've said already that most of our oak data comes from the south and the east, but actually we have one really valuable, a long reference chronology from Randolph's Hall at Darnaway Castle, which has to have been built with their own timber from the Forest of Darnaway, and that amazing roof was built in the late 14th century from their own timber, and it gives us a long span of oak data from 969 to 1387, and it is the means by which we have recognised Darnaway timber elsewhere. So Darnaway bucked the trend, actually. While much of Scotland was perhaps not managing its timber resources, Darnaway did, and for many hundreds of years. And it turns up not just through the dendro evidence, but through the documentary evidence as well. And it was called on by the Crown on many occasions to supply timber over long distances, for example. And here is one recent example of finding Darnaway timber a long way from home. This is part of a project called the South East Scotland Oak Dendro Project, which is my research project funded by Historic Environment Scotland. And I have done a lot of reconnaissance and whittled down to a few sites to study in detail, and absolutely remarkably hidden in plain sight in the centre of Edinburgh, in the tower of St Giles High Kirk, is this remarkable 5-storey bell frame. Much of it is built from oak, really long sequences, sort of 200 to 300-year-old trees used. Beautiful timber, absolutely gorgeous quality, lovely joinery work and carpentry as well. And so guess what it matched with? I mean, I nearly fell off my lab stool when I found out, but it matches incredibly closely with Darnaway. You know, almost same tree kind of closely, you know, really high T values. And it's really interesting to be able to get such precise felling dates for things, because then you can interrogate the documentary evidence and other evidence. And in this way, we have been able to see that this work was probably begun under James II, but continued by his widow, Queen Mary of Guelders, because James II was killed in an accident at Roxburgh in 1460. And the dates that I have are only for the first 3 levels of a 5-storey frame. There's a date for one of the bells, which, well, it got melted down in the 19th century, but the Great Bell was made in Gelderland in 1460. So, and there is the King's Pillar, which has the arms of James II, of Mary of Guelders, and of their son James III, and she was effectively regent for the infant James III when James II died. So anyway, I could go on about this all day, but you know, absolutely fantastic example of the long distance transport of really high quality oak from Darnaway to Edinburgh. It would have been transported by sea, probably came up through Port of Leith, and this is right on this cusp of the almost wholesale switch to imported timber. So I think this Darnaway was incredibly valuable at this time to the elite, because it was a rare resource. And as I've said, we're on that cusp of moving into all this imported stuff. And here's a nice example in Angus. This little isle, Guthrie Isle, has both Scandinavian beams and those Baltic boards in it. So one of our earliest examples of the importation of both in one place. And here's some more of Anne's work. This is showing those lovely Estland boards that have come from the Eastern Baltic, largely in the 16th century, that were used for carving and indeed for painted ceilings. And I'm just going to run through some of these. You know, I've mentioned that switch to predominantly Scandinavian pine. It starts in the 16th century, it really escalates in the 17th century and carries on into the early 18th century. And then we get that next switch in the middle of the 18th century? Well, from the few sites we have, including Fort George, we have material pine coming from the Eastern Baltic after the middle of the 18th century. Although I do think this may not be the case everywhere, because the military were very sniffy about Scottish timber and didn't really rate it. So they probably insisted on having Baltic pine. So those are all success stories of things we could date. But of course, along this journey, we have learned that it is much easier to date the imports than to date our native material, because the reference data for the exporting countries is so much stronger. There's so much more of it than there is for our own native Scottish timber. And, you know, the work that Anne and I have done over the last 20 years really has been about trying to start filling those gaps, and the work that I've done with Rob on pine has been about trying to fill some of these gaps so that we can date our own native timber, so we can recognise it even. So, for example, here's some sites that really were difficult to date. Edeloch, Crannog. Well, the first samples from there were taken in the 1940s, I think, and were in Fort William Museum. It required the Scottish Pine Project to build up the reference data to enable us to date Edeloch to the 16th century. The reason I'm doing the South East Scottish Oak Project is because I worked on a building in Jedburgh and I couldn't date it for ages because there was no local oak reference data. Eventually was able to date it against Northern English data. But, you know, we need to build up our own regional reference data to be able to date buildings and sites. Many of our vernacular buildings have all sorts of interesting timber types in them. And for example, here at Moyle Lanark, which is near Killin, we have a probably late 18th century building, maybe early 19th century, that has many species in it. It's principally got ash in its crux, but it has some elm and some pine and even some sycamore in it. And so we're still working on building up the reference data for ash, and we need to just get back a little bit further and get a bit more data, but then we'll be able to start dating ash buildings as well. But as Rob has mentioned, much of our focus has been on building up the native pine record. And, you know, this is unique to Scotland, really, in the British Isles. You know, we have our native pine woods as well as oak woods. The English building stock is principally built with oak, but in Scotland, we have used pine historically for a very, very long time. And Anne and I just began trying to work on some pine buildings and to build up the reference data in this first project, the Native Oak and Pine Project. And these are some of the things we worked on then. And we got some tentative dates for a couple of buildings then. We also looked at some oak there, and I won't go into detail here, but, you know, we looked at Drum Castle and the old wood of Drum and tried to get as long a record as we could from one site. And these are the sorts of sites that could be really valuable to us, where there is both old living wood and historic use of their own local timber. But as Rob has mentioned, this Scottish Pine Project, this Scot 2K part of it was the part that I was involved in, and I worked on historic buildings and some archaeological sites alongside Rob and his team's work on building up the reference data from trees and subfossil material. And we managed to date 20 buildings that way, and I will quickly whiz through them from the earliest to the latest. Well, here's the turn up for the books. The earliest use of Scots pine is in St Andrews and is a long way from home because it matches most closely with the Cairngorms and is 15th century. Now, I said it takes a long time to date some of the stuff that's been sampled. Well, we rescued these samples actually in the early 90s and couldn't date them until was about 2015, I think, when we eventually dated them. So, you know, it is worth taking the samples because eventually the data and the science will catch up. We have some 16th century examples, including, as I mentioned, Dendrochronological, which is late 16th century, and 2 castles, Castle Mingus in Perthshire, dates to 1572, fabulous native pine roof, and there's some remains of an early roof in Castle Grant as well, which is probably sort of mid to late 16th century as well. Bit of a gap in the 17th century, just one elusive sarking board so far, but the 17th century is when sawmills were introduced to Scotland, and I think we need to look at loads more sarking, which was often made of pine, and we will start to find and be able to recreate our 17th century pine woods from the sarking. So it's not only structural timbers, the sarking is going to be hugely important in building up this record. We have some late 17th into early 18th century dates, including the crypt hatch at Wardlaw Mausoleum, which is near Bewley in Kirkhill. Really, some really nice boards used for that crypt hatch, actually, probably off the Lovett estates. After the 45, well, we have kind of a big rebuilding thing going on, and you know, obviously a lot of buildings were destroyed in or around the 45, and so we see some of this rebuilding going on at places like Alagi House, for example, which has got dates of 1748 and then an extension in 1783. And the dune at Rothiemurchus, well, that's an interesting story. The material from that episode at the dune, we only have 1 timber, but it matches better with Scandinavian pine than with native pine, even pine from Rothiemurchus, and it is likely that they did not have any pine of sufficient size anymore by that time to build this particular extension to the dune. It needed some really massive timbers, and they were probably imported, which is pretty ironic. The Highland Folk Museum has a big collection of pine timbers, and we've dated a few of these, and these are dating to the late 18th century and are mainly from cruck frame buildings that were being demolished in the 1970s mainly. Then we have some extant composite cruck frames, which are all dating to around about 1800 or just after, and you know, they're using local material, and some of it looks ever so like plantation material. And then we've come right up into the middle of the 19th century and dated some of these, well, you know, a range of sort of improvement era buildings, I suppose, mainly. And I've mentioned plantation pine. Well, there's some really big differences amongst the character of the material that we got from buildings, historic buildings. Some of the early ones especially, had these really long ring patterns, which are much more like natural material and much more like high elevation material, actually, when you think about it. But then some medieval sites had really young timber. I couldn't date Abertarf House in Inverness because it doesn't have enough rings in it, basically, and it's fast grown. It looks rather like plantation material, as does, to a degree, Castle Mingus roof. But then there's another possible argument here, which is that trees were being selected for felling based on size and regularity and accessibility, and it may be that we're looking at a sort of selective felling pattern of younger material that was just easier to work with. So in Scott 2K we dated 20 of our 35 sites. Dates range from between the 15th to the 19th century. Importantly, this has included some vernacular buildings because those rarely get looked at. We concluded that we really do need multiple samples per site and sequences at least over 60, but we prefer lots more samples and lots more rings to secure dating. Where we couldn't date them, that was usually because the ring counts were low, or the condition was really bad, or we didn't have enough samples. And we're seeing, therefore, through the buildings, we're seeing another aspect of the environmental and climate record as well. you know, these are all parts of aspects of the same big story, aren't they? And we are seeing impacts, or at least use of our native pine woods from at least the 15th century, and probably that occurred earlier. We're just yet to find the evidence for it. So I've talked a little bit about gaps, and I would like to mention that Anne Crone and I are campaigning for the better uptake of dendrochronology in Scotland. The map you see on the left-hand side is the distribution of dated historic buildings, dendro-dated historic buildings. And as you can see, we have rather few in Scotland compared to England, where they have dates for over 4,000. I think it's heading to 4,500 now, listed buildings. That's just listed buildings. We have about 40 building sites dated in Scotland, just nudging over that now, but ever so slow, given that Anne and I have been here working in dendro for over 30 years. We have always had to chase the work. The work has rarely come to us. Most of this is done through our own research. This is not the case in England. This is all commissioned work in England. And therefore, we would really like to encourage all heritage gatekeepers, national and regional, to have a look at this and to change the way we do things, because we are losing data, we are losing sites, we are losing opportunities all the time. As I showed you earlier, a concentration of dates around the 4th, well, that in part is because the Edinburgh City Council have insisted on dendro in in a good number of sites. Well, we have 8 sites dated because of that in Edinburgh, and 5 in East Lothian, but otherwise we have either 0 or 1 site per council authority. And you can read more about this on the Timberwatch Scotland page on the Dendrochronicle website. So just a wee reminder of those gaps. You know, we would like to see far more dots on this map, especially in the north and the west. This is just a little update. Some of you will have heard some of this talk before, because I've given it before for various northern audiences, but things that have happened since Scott 2K. Well, for example, here's a little building on the Bewley Braes that Roland Spencer Jones recorded in 2020, and he did send me some images of the pine timbers. Actually, it was built with really young pine timber, which is not so unusual. Too few rings to date at the moment, but I have asked Roland to keep some samples, because our methods are changing, and I won't go into that now, but there is the potential in the future that we may be able to date younger timber. I'm going to spare people's blushes and not mention individual sites by name, but I absolutely know, and so does Anne, of some of the ones that have the opportunities that have been missed. And it isn't just the unlisted buildings. It starts at the top with a scheduled ancient monument, works its way through listed buildings of every rank, and through to those undesignated historic buildings. And really, you know, this has to change. We are losing precious data, not just for our cultural heritage work, but for the climate record. And hopefully I have made a case there for a change. And I wanted to give you a news flash on the Castle of Old Wick, which some of you will have seen in the social media coverage and in the news. I was there a couple of weeks ago retrieving, let's say, a timber, the one and only timber left in the Castle of Old Wick, which is a ruin on a headland, as you can see. And I thought before I got to site, having seen photographs of it, that it was probably going to be oak. And we have retrieved it, but in careful examination back in the lab, it is not oak. Actually, it is alder, which is really, really interesting. And we think it perhaps is not a joist, not a big structural timber. It's probably to do with the fitting, and there are various theories about what it might be, but it could be part of the fitting for a lum, because there's a possible fireplace next to this socket, and this is intermediate between floor levels actually, or it just possibly could be to do with scaffolding that was used to build the tower in the first place. Because it's older, even though it's got 80 rings, the trouble is for dendrodating that we have no older reference data for the medieval period or for northern Scotland. So we're going to use radiocarbon wiggle matching, which means taking several subsamples across the ring sequence, and we'll get quite a refined date by doing that. Those are just about to go to the radiocarbon lab, and it will be a few months before we have the result. I'm going to skip through very quickly applications in woodland heritage, just to say that, as Rob has mentioned, really old living trees are really valuable to us in terms of building up the most recent end of the record, and they can cover, maybe 500 years in one site. That is hugely valuable to us, and some of our old parks and forests have provided really valuable information and really useful data for us. In the South East Scotland project, I have built a new chronology from the Dalkeith Old Oaks, which spans right back to the middle of the 16th century. And we have also recovered a really long history of park woodland management here, with coppicing also going back to the 16th century. Peter Quelch and I have looked in detail at old sort of hunting forests and wood pastures around the south side of Loch Katrine, the bit that most people don't go to, and this has produced a really sort of interwoven, multidisciplinary kind of outcome, because we've looked at documents, maps, the trees themselves, the tree rings, the archaeology. When you bring all these aspects together, then you start to build up a really insightful, hopefully, picture of how woods were managed and how people and woods interacted in the past. And in pre-improvement times, those woods were so important. Those wood pastures provided sheltered grazing for the stock during the winter, especially. The big switch to intensive sheep farming at the end of the 18th century here probably sort of fossilized those wood pastures and prevented new regeneration. And so we can get insights from this sort of work about how we should manage, or how we could manage, woodlands in the future. We can look at old working woods, and there are many of those around Scotland, and old oak coppices are one of the most common, and of course they were managed for the production of well, charcoal everybody knows about, but tan bark was also hugely important, and quite often more valuable than anything else. We can look at designed landscapes and age elements in a designed landscape by aging the trees in them and on features in them. And I won't go into details, but it's important for you to know that that is a possibility. We can age boundary features, and they often get sort of absorbed into later plantations, but you can find quite early and old trees along old boundaries within younger plantations, for example, and we can date them, and therefore we can date changes in the landscape. And Rob has mentioned old plantations. Well, just here's an example we had an opportunity to have a look at a few years ago at Granton-on-Spey. We have plantations which were established when the town was established, and it was a new town, of course, in the late 18th century. But if we would love, Rob and I, to get a handle on how far back these pine plantations go. And so that's work still to be done. I'm very delighted to see how the Highland Archaeology Research Framework has recognised the importance of dendrochronology for future research in the Highlands. And let's not go into details, but here are just here are a few examples of the research recommendations and questions that could be addressed through dendrochronology. And finally, my conclusions. Well, the Highlands have been the most wooded region of Scotland, and still pretty much are when you're looking at semi-natural woodland at least. And the historic timber supply story, therefore, in the Highlands will be incredibly different from that from the south and the east, southeast. Yet we have a really big gap. You know, we have had the opportunity to look at very few buildings and sites in Scotland, in northern Scotland. If we could look at those sites, we would have the benefits not just of dating, but of building up the bigger reference data set so that we could date other buildings and sites, and we would be contributing to the environmental history and the climate studies that are ongoing. We therefore need sort of tighter controls on timbers that are being impacted through development and repair. That really is not unique to the Highlands, that this isn't really happening very much. It is much of Scotland, it is the same story, but this is on the cusp of changing, and there are changes coming through, and you will start to see them, I believe, and I hope. Oddly enough, if a timber is found in an archaeological site below ground, it would almost certainly be studied, whilst its partner in a standing historic building will not be. And that's a peculiar twist of how things are applied. But what we really particularly need to start improving on is the protection and opportunities to study timbers from historic buildings. And also, you know, there's so much woodland heritage work that could be done in the Highlands. Very little of that has happened either. But dendrochronology is not just about dating archaeological sites or dating buildings. It also informs our understanding of climate change, our understanding of biodiversity and how management and biodiversity interact. And of course, that's all very relevant to reforesting issues as well as cultural heritage. And thank you so much for your attention.